Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, March 7th, 2023. Time for another show. Today being Tuesday, of course, it's ordinarily Joan McCarter Day. Joan taking a little breather for this week. And couldn't we all use one? Let's all breathe, as a matter of fact. Let's... Okay, that wasn't a very deep breath. But okay, we have things to get to and stories to tell. There's always plenty, of course. But it feels like there's a giant gap. Okay, all right. Well, anyway, next week, I'm sure we'll be back online and everything will be running smoothly. And as I mentioned in the Morning Post, it is 3 Greg units until she comes back again. So we filled the rest of the week as well. And, all right. Well, no problem. We move on past this and we'll just have to find ways to keep each other busy for the next couple of hours. I am reminded by Justice's behind the scenes notes with the, indication that everything is working, that Tucker Carlson, I guess, has now had exclusive possession of the January 6th surveillance footage for, I don't know, a week or two now, and I guess he must have put together his first show in which he attempts to explain that January 6th actually was very nice or didn't happen. I think this morning I saw somebody saying on Twitter that, making the joke that he's proved that the Titanic, sailed smoothly across the Atlantic, no problems, made its crossing, actually landed in New York, and everybody who says it didn't is lying. It's all a bunch of garbage, etc., etc. So similarly, I guess, we kind of knew what was going to happen with that footage, was that there was going to be hours and hours of footage in which there are clearly people more or less wandering through the halls, waving flags, pushing their way in doors that they don't belong in, but not murdering people on camera or anything like that. And so he would use that to say, see, it was a peaceful protest, nothing wrong with it. Except, of course, the building was closed to visitors, and there was an official proceeding going on in the Capitol itself, for which the complex was supposed to be, more or less locked down, and they had to smash the windows to get in there in the first place. But not only that, they had to battle cops and beat them over the head and drag them down the stairs in order to get to the windows to smash. So, what are you going to do? That's exactly what they were planning on doing with the footage, and now they've done it. And we note for the record that they have. And we see how deeply they're able to penetrate into the greater American voter psyche with their nonsense. And I guess we'll measure it duly and make notes and complain about it later. That's kind of all we're stuck doing at the moment because, I don't know, we can't just round these people up and lock them up forever because of American exceptionalism. That's the way it is. And that's the way we like it, too. Anyway, just reviewing all the notes from yesterday and thinking about what we might discuss today. I might dive straight back into that article that I got about half of it on the record from 2019, the Civil War scholar who had made the interesting discovery that the battlers against woke ideology and free speech warriors that we are dealing with these days on both the extreme right and, as it happens, I don't mean to both sides of the issue, but I guess I will horseshoe theory the issue that, we've got at least a few people on either side of the horseshoe insisting that they're just asking questions or just want to have a free debate, and you're against free speech if you are against my totally distorting what's going on. Anyway, very interesting historical parallel, and perhaps we should return to that. I have, though, in front of me the the opportunity to update you on George Santos once again, as Scott has sent me this link from Talking Points memo. Let's see if I can. I guess I can't get all the way through it, although I think that they've got a pretty robust firewall system such that Pocket doesn't defeat it, but it's a very intriguing headline at the very least. So we'll definitely share that. And I'm not a TPM member, and maybe one day we should do that. But this members-only article in the editor's blog is headlined, "Meet the Contract Killer." And do be careful if you're going to meet a contract killer. But this contract killer now represents George Santos in Brazil, which, sounds a little fascinating. This is actually, though, look at that. It's from February 2nd. So it's about, it's a little over a month old, and we missed this one entirely, I think. Let's see. And it started out with, it says, "I'm not sure the George Santos stories keep getting worse, but they do get weirder and more bizarre." And this was back in February. So, as we learned way back at the beginning of the Santos saga, he remains a wanted man in Brazil. I mean, that is to say, they seek his arrest. Nobody actually wants him in Brazil, I'm sure, for check fraud that he committed back in 2008. After he became an international celebrity in December, Brazilian authorities decided to reinitiate the case, which had stalled when they couldn't locate him. After the case was reopened, Santos hired a Brazilian lawyer to represent him in that revived case. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, since it's George Santos, that he managed to find a lawyer who's a convicted murderer, and in fact, a convicted contract killer. How exciting for all involved. That's the extent of the article that I'm able to read from the other side of the paywall, although they do have a photo of the person, and he looks very contracty, maybe a little killery, I guess you could say, if he looks otherwise normal. But let's see, what's the name on this guy here? Jonymar, Jonymar, Jonymar? I don't know. Vasconcelos. There we go. Vasconcelos. So, Jonymar Vasconcelos. It's my best guess at the name of this 47-year-old. That's amazing. 47. The ripe old age of 47 as a contract killer. Convicted. So we can go ahead and say it. All right. Well, at least we have that going on. All right. Well, let's see. Other interesting things. Well, nothing else is interesting about that story because I can't tell. I can't tell what's going on here. Although I wonder if somebody else might have some reportage on that subject. Let's go take a look. How common could that name really be, right? Let's see, the Daily Beast on it. I mean, I could run into a paywall with the Daily Beast too, I guess. Let's see what's going on here. No? All right. Let's see. You can read it all at this Brazilian paper, which I assume is in Portuguese. So we'll take the Daily Beast's word and version for it. George Santos's Brazil lawyer did time for gang execution, according to a report. This one filed way back again in February 2nd. The lawyer that George Santos chose to defend him in his fraud case in Brazil was convicted and jailed in connection with a gang execution, according to a report. So, Jonymar Vasconcelos, 47, once again for the record, was sentenced to 18 years in prison in 2007 for his role in the fatal shooting of a mechanic 3 years earlier. This according to Sao Paulo's Folha, maybe, newspaper. That was reported, also a little earlier in February, maybe late January. Vasconcelos, who was reportedly paid for the hit, went with 3 other men to the home of Aristu Vieira de Matos. In the early hours of December 3rd, 2004, Vasconcelos, who was in Brazil's Navy at the time, remained on a motorcycle while the killing took place. An extraordinary feat. In 2009, he was moved to house arrest and began studying law. he had the time for it. It's unclear how Santos found Vasconcelos to defend him in the fraud case, in which it's alleged the congressman paid for goods with a stolen checkbook in 2008, given that Vasconcelos is reportedly not affiliated with any law firm and does not list contact information online. When approached by Folha, the newspaper, the paper says Santos replied that he doesn't understand Portuguese, despite speaking Portuguese fluently in interviews, and then did not respond to questions sent in English. So that's quite remarkable. Here, of course, the link, the opportunity to read it all in Folha de Sao Paulo. But, of course, we don't understand Portuguese. We legitimately don't understand Portuguese. How interesting for him to say he doesn't. Remarkable for him to say there's anything at all that he doesn't understand. He's got a hand in everything. So, all right. That helps fill out the picture, even if it is, it's a little bit backdated, but we definitely missed that one. That was new to me. Any other, well, I guess I should pocket that so I can find it again. Let me head back to, is there any more information or perhaps later developed? It's all reported in early February. I'm looking around to see if there might be something, more recent, like, well, oh yeah, that's right. And, either also he's a, fentanyl smuggler or anything like that. No. Looks like it's all, one big flurry of coverage and then nothing else. So I guess now that we all know that he's guilty of an accomplice in an execution style gang contract killing, that's it. Yeah. What else do you have to say about that? I'm representing the guy. That's all there is to it. And then everybody just leaves it alone. I guess we're normalizing things in Brazil, just like we're normalizing things here. Okay, so let's see. Speaking of normalizing, we didn't read the entirety of the article. I know Greg recommended it yesterday and read from it to some extent. And I don't usually double back to say, what does Jennifer Rubin have to say about anything in particular? But I did see people circulating that article again. Good reminder, just generally speaking. The piece under the headline, Timid Media and GOP figures are again dangerously normalizing Trump. And, I know we definitely read some excerpts from it, but I guess it bears repeating just how unhinged he was at CPAC and how little coverage the mainstream media, the traditional media, appears to be giving to the fact that he's completely out of his mind. Instead, it's just, more Trump being Trump stuff. So, at the risk of repeating ourselves a little bit, I'll read a little from Jennifer Rubin's piece from yesterday, again, cited by Greg. We saw throughout Donald Trump's 2 presidential campaigns and 4 years in the White House a symbiotic relationship between mainstream media outlets and the Republicans, in which both made Trump out to be a far more normal politician than he was. We know that to be the governing dynamic with Trump world here. On the one hand, there was Republican denial. Didn't see the crazy tweet. I'm sure he's learned his lesson, that sort of stuff. On the other, there was the media's determination to avoid claims of bias and maintain a false balance, which often resulted in their obscuring how loony he sounded. The result, a never-ending Trumpian stream of threats, both policy-related and more personal, absurd conspiracy mongering, more mongering, right, and lies that were never regarded as disqualifying. Apparently, which pronunciation should we go with? Neither or neither? Neither the media nor supposedly sober Republicans have learned anything from the past. Well, of course not. Trump gave a bonkers speech at CPAC conference on Saturday, musing about Russia blowing up NATO headquarters, claiming President Biden had taken the border wall and put it in a hiding area. And what? Maybe it's just made of stealth material. And telling the crowd, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. Which is, an overt threat and pretty scary, and quite honestly, what can I tell you? The guy should be Ceausescu'd, and we should be rid of him forever. Thank you. We do not get headlines acknowledging this is unhinged. Instead, we get from the New York Times, quote, Trump says he would stay in 2024 race if indicted, and a similar angle from CNN. ABC started its website report this way. Former President Donald Trump continues to reign supreme over the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Washington Post going with Trump takes victory lap at conservative conference. CBS intoned that Trump aired grievances with his familiar foes, President Biden, the Department of Justice, and the litany of legal fights he's embroiled in. Politico went with Trump ties a ribbon on the most MAGA CPAC yet. From the coverage, you would never understand how incoherent he sounds, how far divorced his statements are from reality, and how entirely abnormal this all is. Talk about burying the lead. And once again, I guess if you're not particularly happy with the idea that Trump really should be placed under house arrest and or, electrocuted after due trial and, fair due process of law, et cetera, that he's a seriously dangerous psychopath traitor. And again, we just really need to be finished with him forever. And if we can't finish him by dismissing him politically in the newspapers, and they seem unable to do that, and maybe it's not even their job to do that. They could decide to drop the ball if they want to. But how much more of this can we take? I don't know. But if you're not happy with that, I guess you could at least say, all right, well, treat the threats seriously and, press the legal cases against him. And at least to do that much, I suppose. Or, it might also be nice to say this guy is obviously too dangerous to be considered sane. And or we could press the case that I have raised this point in the past, that at the very least, you might consider looking into very seriously charging his children with elder abuse. I mean, he's so far divorced from reality. The idea of continuing to try to milk his political career for profit, which is what they were always doing the first time. But now to continue with this seems like, maybe a reasonable case of elder abuse, just trotting the old man out to keep the money machine flowing when he really should be under psychiatric care. Anyway, the press and Republicans' mutual distaste for candidly acknowledging Trump's break with reality and the danger he poses to democracy was on full display on the Sunday shows. On Meet the Press, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu lamely offered that he'd support whomever the Republicans nominate for president. Equally cringeworthy Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska on This Week wouldn't rule out supporting a nominee indicted on a felony charge that involved overthrowing the 2020 election results. That's a huge hypothetical right now on an indictment issue, but right now my plan is to support who becomes the nominee. On Fox News Sunday, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said it's time to reject any candidate who would tell whoppers and spends endless time on Twitter, but dodged the question when host Shannon Bream said surely he must be talking about Trump. Yeah, well, of course he is. And yet, right, dodging the question. This spectacle is equal parts infuriating and pathetic. Here are Republicans, some of whom are considering runs for the presidency, who somehow expect to get through a campaign without mentioning the single most disqualifying thing about the leader in the race. Other than his mental unfitness, he betrayed the country. Such timidity is itself disqualifying for someone seeking the presidency. If these candidates cannot stand up to an ex-president who is currently devoid of power, how can we expect them to defend the Constitution against enemies foreign and domestic? Although I think a better question would be, how could we possibly consider them to remain loyal to our system of government and the Constitution should this man ever be put back in power? If they can't stand up to him when he has no power, how will they stand up to him if he has it? I know that the old trope is to say, well, how can you stand up to enemies foreign and domestic? Well, focus on the domestic for a minute. I am not that concerned about the ability of Republicans to make noise and saber rattle when it comes to enemies foreign. Enemies domestic, I have less confidence in. And Donald Trump, of course, none whatsoever. Not only do I have no confidence in him, but I have no confidence in their ability to stand up to him. If he ever, given that he has no power, then they can't do it. You can only imagine what might happen if he were returned to office. It's not impossible to show some spine. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson reacted to the CPAC speech on CNN's State of the Union, saying, first of all, if you want to heal our land, unite our country together, you don't do it by appealing to the angry mob. Whenever you're looking at the leader of our country, you don't want him to be engaged in a personal vendetta, Hutchinson said. Well, we don't. Republicans do, though. When Trump talks about vengeance, he added, he's talking about his personal vendettas, and that's not healthy for America. It's certainly not healthy for our party. See, how hard is that? To top this, Hutchinson criticized the idea that any GOP candidate for president should have to agree to a loyalty pledge to support other GOP candidates as a condition for appearing in any debate, something Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel has said she plans to require. The goal of such a pledge, Hutchinson asserted, was to avoid a situation in which a spurned GOP contender might run as a third-party candidate. That would be the threat from Donald Trump, he said. If you're going to have a pledge, have it say that the candidates who participate in a debate are not going to run as third-party candidates, and that would solve the issue. Hutchinson remains a lonely island of decency in a sea of cowardice. And quite right, and by the way, that's a great way to shift it. I can accept the idea that Ronna McDaniel probably thought that she was eliminating the third-party, sore loser situation by saying, well, you'll have to, in order to participate in the debates, you'll have to pledge to support whoever the nominee is. But that does make the problem backwards. You put the vast majority of the field in an awkward position, and they have to say dumb things like, well, my plan is to support whoever the nominee is, but I don't want to support someone who makes threats and is out for personal vengeance and spends all their time on Twitter. Well, obviously you mean Trump, but you won't even come around to saying it. Of course, it also puts Trump in an awkward position because we know how he answers the question of, will you support whoever the nominee is? Well, we'll see. It depends who the nominee actually is. Well, that's a no. So if you need to say that you'll support whoever the nominee is in order to participate in the debates, then we have our answer. Trump will not be allowed to participate in the debates. But it also means probably everybody, if they answered honestly, would not be permitted to participate in the debates, which, I don't know whether that's good or bad for them. I don't know whether that's good or bad for us. But you could certainly clarify the question by saying, will you pledge, if you don't win the nomination, not to run as a third-party candidate? And I think probably, 90% of the Republican field would be willing to pledge to that. Trump also will not be willing to pledge to that. We'll see what happens. If the nomination is stolen from me because the election is rigged, then I can't promise not to run. The American people will want me to run. And if they vote for me in overwhelming numbers, but stolen, I can't. It would be wrong for me to dishonor what the American people wanted. Make some kind of excuse like that. Whereas everybody else would say, no, I'm running as a Republican or nothing. So, and who knows, maybe that isn't even true. All right. Well, anyway, let's see. We left off with this piece only about halfway through here. Like most Republican politicians, a good deal of the mainstream media is equally reticent when it comes to defending our democracy. You had to go to an unabashed progressive outlet such as HuffPost to get an accurate, complete sense of what happened at CPAC. Trump to his followers, I am your retribution, its headline read, followed by, the coup-attempting former president brought his usual grievances back to a diminished CPAC. Coverage can be so bland and innocuous as to mislead. The audience, that is, potential voters, might easily come away from such coverage believing that Trump acted like a normal candidate, not a figure plainly unfit to handle any public position. And interviews can be so inept as to allow Republicans to repeatedly avoid explaining how in the world they could support someone so unfit for office. If you put cowering Republicans together with media unwilling to accurately describe what is going on in front of them, you wind up gaslighting voters who come away with the impression that Trump's carnival of crazy is acceptable. We know how this ends. If no one is willing to call out Trump for what he is and the danger he poses to the United States, we risk returning him to the Oval Office. Whereupon, expect the headlines, "How did this happen?" Well, true and actually correct. And, I still don't like Jennifer Rubin. I'm still not over the weird ways and distorted ways in which she approached things back when they had normal Republicans. So I'm still kind of uncomfortable aligning with her. But can I tell you, it makes sense and it's saying the right things, and we have to acknowledge that. And, I don't know whether this is really a change of heart in Jennifer Rubin or in us, or in neither, or in both. But, one day she'll find herself back to bashing Democrats, no doubt, in the near future. And that's, I guess, where she'd like to get back to if she could only get normal politicians to be on the side of. All right. So we come up now to our first break. I can check in on the various social media inputs, but it looks like we are all up to date on suggestions from others about story ideas, and perhaps we can return to that interesting historical analysis of Civil War rhetoric, which means, of course, trying to say the word rhetoricians. Again, we've been over it with this word, too, and I think I actually made an off-the-air attempt at one point, months or maybe even years ago, to get a pronunciation of the word. I guess I need a refresher. It all becomes a blur when you worry about pronunciation of every single word and every single name every single day. You tend to forget. But the one that sunk in for me, of course, is Willamette. We got that one because we had a great mnemonic device. All right, we'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, you remember yesterday? That was great, wasn't it? So, that was awesome. Channeling a little old Saturday Night Live just for a second. Anyway, we left off yesterday having read a bit of this this piece, and I'll have to scroll all over again to make it work here. The Reasonable Rebels. You remember this one? And our everybody's good friend Greg Green had been tweeting around that he too had come basically to the same conclusion and was reminded just a few years after the publication of this piece of just how much similarity there was. This sense of deja vu for this Civil War researcher, saying that we have gotten to the same place in our rhetoric as we did prior to and then even immediately after the Civil War, which is not a good thing in terms of, if you're worried about the threats from Republicans like Murdery Trader Green about Civil War and the taunts and the constant teasing that they're in fact, openly calling for a second civil war, but trying to do so in a way that gives them wiggle room and play coy and say, no, I'm simply saying whatever the hell else it is. But at any rate, that a lot of the rhetoric for expressing the grievances that would lead somebody to say that we ought to have either, as she puts it, a national divorce or what have you, which, by the way, is an interesting solution for her to suggest. I mean, I'm surprised that she didn't suggest that maybe rather than going through the drama of national divorce, the costly process of national divorce, we just should sort of nationally cheat on on one another. How about that? Everybody could just have national affairs together, which I guess is what CPAC really is. You get together and you flirt about treason, for instance, and then never get around to the divorce because it would simply cost you too much. Anyway, interesting thesis of this piece, which is essentially that the Old South used to use the same rhetoric. I'm just asking questions about slavery. How can we have a real conversation about slavery when we are made to feel as if we're not welcome in polite society to discuss society? There, I threw a little Southern pronunciation at you. To discuss such important questions of the day, and instead we are shunned as, well, to use the modern terminology for it, and I have always been puzzled about why this is not an issue for modern MAGA. I'm not really puzzled. I mean, I just attribute it to gimmitarianism. But just to use another term for it, human trafficking. Like I guess you could say I'm fake puzzled. I mean, I understand the reasoning for it. The reasoning being I want to be able to do what I want to do and complain about what I want to complain about, and I don't want to have logic get in the way. I just want to have my grievances. So, for instance, why human trafficking is this outrageous, I mean, it is, and why it's considered by MAGA Republicans to be the be-all, end-all of political issues. And it's because, of course, they think these are charges that they can level against Democrats and which can never be leveled against them, even though the major every time they end up arresting human traffickers, they end up being MAGA weirdos. So I don't really know what to tell you about that. But yeah, human trafficking, it's the worst thing in the world. And, arguably, yes, it is. And we have to do anything we can to stop it. But also we need to maintain our statues and, preserve our history of the slavers who were, of course, human traffickers. I don't think that they would think, for instance, that, when they accuse, they accuse Joe Biden, as they frequently do, of being you're a pedophile and a human trafficker. So are you, Hillary Clinton. Well, they're not, but that's what they say. What would they then say about the attempt to, let's say, erect a statue somewhere of either of them now or later on? Well, no, how dare you, because human traffickers. Well, a while ago you were telling us that we had to keep all the statues of all the human traffickers because they were Confederate human traffickers, and you liked that. And for anybody who tries to draw the line, well, they're talking about sexual predation as the driving motivation for the trafficking. Oh, yeah? I'm sorry, was that actually supposed to be a point of differentiation from slavery? Because that was the most peculiar part of the peculiar institution was that all of these slavers who for some reason had to insist to themselves in order to justify this stuff, mentally, psychologically, in order to remain a slaver, to tell yourself and others that you had to believe that black people were somehow other than human, that they were livestock to you. But then at the same time, that you just kept raping your livestock, but you were a person. I'm genuinely shocked why I'm being excluded from polite conversation, says John Wilkes Booth, who says it should be, recognized as the God-given right of every Southern gentleman to rape the livestock from time to time and then keep the children out in the backyard as servants. Well, that's rather peculiar, as they say. about the institution, but also, indefensible on any level, we might say, perhaps, and just really no redeeming value to it whatsoever, and it needed to be stamped out by force of arms. Okay, yes, I guess I would agree with that. And now, of course, at the time, we now learn that the rhetoric of the day was, well, we're just asking questions. Maybe we should be allowed to do this. Maybe this is a great idea. Maybe this is exactly what God wants. Whatever the argument was. But how interesting was the parallel of their anger, not so much over being denied the opportunity to continue the practice as they claimed it was in being denied the right to defend the practice rather than practice the practice. I'm just saying that we should have free and open debate about this horrible, horrific thing about which hundreds of years later, even the people who are somehow defenders of the Confederacy still say the actual practice was horrific and terrible, and we can prove that they really believe that, except they only believe that Democrats did it. Well, one, of course, they have the weird, unfortunate historical reference that, through various realignments of political affiliations, the truth is that the then existing Democratic Party was the home of the defenders of slavery, and they have since all relocated to, ironically enough, the Republican Party, which arose as an abolitionist party. And it's weird and strange that all of that we would have switched positions so entirely, but these things do happen. This one did happen, and we watched it happen. But I'm most struck by the extent to which John Wilkes Booth sounds like exactly who he was. I mean, if we have difficulty understanding him perhaps as a historical figure, he's all we can do in order to grasp John Wilkes Booth and the person he is to, in historical context, say, well, he's just one of those historically evil figures who was bent on destruction from the beginning and became an assassin and was a fanatic and all these things are true still, and nothing about this understanding of his rhetoric changes our mind about that. But it does give us a different and interesting modernizing perspective to say, well, he was, an incel dark web, reply guy, essentially. I don't know what his personal habits were at the time. Maybe he wasn't an incel, but, the same sort of, social interaction that he had been, that he would have been listening to Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson this whole time and saying, I'm just asking questions about slavery, and it makes me mad that people exclude me from polite society because I think that there should be a civil conversation about maybe we should be doing human trafficking and raping the livestock, and that's an awesome thing to do. Or, even, maybe he doesn't go there, but the fact that you would regard people as non-people and people as property, that's fairly disgusting, and people don't want to talk to you. Well, that makes me so angry that I want to shoot the people who don't want to talk to you. Well, that's amazing. I mean, that's amazing all by itself. It's also, what a coincidence. The rest of us want to shoot you. But, for the most part, we refrain outside of the context of, well, everything's gone to hell in a handbasket. We're at war now, and now it's okay to actually shoot them. Under certain circumstances, we're just going to have to go out and shoot these people en masse. That's, for all the people who are saying we got to have a civil war, I know that they're only thinking, well, we'll be doing all the shooting this time, and then it will justify our shooting the libs en masse. Except, maybe it goes the wrong way this time, but to the extent that people say we must not, the people who say don't destroy our statues because we have to learn from and remember our history. The history is there's a lot more people out there that think the things you think are worthy of discussion, civil discussion, are in fact so disgusting that we'd rather kill you than have that conversation. And I know this time you think there's more of you or that your guns are more powerful, but it's not actually true. And I don't know. We left the statues there for you to learn from, and you just didn't. So, one, I guess we'll have to kill you all over again. And two, this time we shouldn't even bother with the statues. We should tie you to the statues and shoot you there. Get rid of two birds with one stone. All right. So, enough opinion. Let's go back to this piece here. Oh, I've scrolled all the way past the author's name again. I'll just remind you. The Reasonable Rebels, a piece from the Washington Post way back on August 29th, 2019 by Eve Fairbanks. And now I know the spot where we left off and I can scroll back down to it. And by way of reintroducing you into this point in the story, I will recap a little bit of what we read at the end of yesterday's rendition, right? Okay, so let's see. Is it true that it's career ending to be of the so-called reasonable right? Shapiro's recent, and we're talking about Ben Shapiro, his recent book back in 2019, The Right Side of History, was a New York Times #1 bestseller. Rubin's, not Jennifer, but I forget which Rubin we're actually talking about. Was it David Rubin? Rubin's YouTube channel has more than 1 million subscribers, and last year he was the subject of an admiring 4,000-word profile in Playboy. Remember this part? Jordan Peterson, bragged that scalpers were charging more for sold out appearance than for tickets of a Toronto Maple Leafs playoff game. That's not the best margin or bar in the world necessarily, but Canada hockey, they're supposed to be crazy for that. A conservative I'm close to routinely emails me political commentaries of her own. She's delighted when I post them on my Facebook page for discussion, but she insists that I conceal her name. Remember, this is the one who, when asked why, points to herself and says, Marano. She, again, the feeling that they're the ones under persecution here. This is extremely important concept to them. So, where were we when we left off? Back to Lincoln. Abraham, that is. Lincoln didn't train his political fire on the most vicious pro-slavery advocates. Instead, he focused it on people like Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who insisted that he didn't support slavery per se. Instead, Douglas claimed he was duty-bound to defend the South's rights on the basis of certain fundamental American principles, including the right to freely choose how you live. Unless you're black, obviously. Lincoln understood that antebellum reasoning was more dangerous than straightforward defenses of chattel slavery. He feared that by claiming to stand for freedom, reason, and civility, and by framing themselves as beleaguered victims, pro-Southern thinkers could draft new warriors who thought they were fighting for something fundamentally American, even if they were wary of slavery itself. And that's what happened. One reason slavery was not abolished in America through the political process as it was in Britain is that abolitionists were rhetorically straitjacketed by the proposition that they were the hardliners who sought to curtail freedom. When the Charleston Mercury wrote that it was the duty of Northerners to prove that they were willing to defend Southerners against fanatics, Northern newspapers reprinted the editorial. Northerners, not Southerners, had to watch what they said and strain to compromise so that they didn't confirm the dictatorial notion Southern rhetoricians had implanted in the public mind. In their 1858 debates, Lincoln pressed Douglas to clarify what kind of America he really wanted, one that had slaves or one that didn't. Douglas claimed only to stand against mob rule. But why, Lincoln asked, was he choosing to die on the South's hill? Why would applying his principle, the mandate to protect the South from interference, quote-unquote interference, by extremist hordes, end up curtailing freedom for millions of black Americans? Was it possible, Lincoln suggested, that Douglas secretly preferred a slave society to a free one? These are the kinds of questions we should be asking of the reasonable right. I know what they say they worry about, but I don't know what they want. A recent Vanity Fair profile of Weiss, Barry Weiss, begins with everything she's been accused of being. Alt-righter, fascist, the provocateur the left loves to hate. There's no evidence that Weiss is widely hated, except by a subsection of Twitter. She's a New York Times opinion writer. She appears regularly on Bill Maher's HBO talk show. But if she's not defined by being hated, then what is she? Many reasonable right figures find themselves defending the liberties of people to the right of them, not because they agree with these people, they say, but on principle. Sam Harris, a popular podcast host, has released 3 lengthy shows about Charles Murray, a political scientist who is often booed at campus speeches and whose 2017 talk at Middlebury College ended when students injured his host. Okay. Murray argues that white people test higher than black people on every known test of cognitive ability, and that these differences in capacity, as he says, predict white people's predominance. Harris repeatedly insists he has no vested interest in Murray's ideas. His only interest in Murray, he claims, rests in his dedication to discussing science and airing controversial views. But Harris's claim is implausible. Hundreds of scientists produce controversial work in the fields of race, demographics, and inequality. Only one, though, is the social scientist nationally notorious for suggesting that white people are innately smarter than people of color. That Harris chooses to invite this one on his show suggests that he is not merely motivated by freedom of speech. It suggests that he is interested in what Murray has to say. I mean, yeah, that's a good point. As I'm saying it, I'm thinking, well, the 1619 Project is controversial on the subject of race. Does he invite the authors there onto the program? No, apparently not. I don't know. Maybe yes. I have no idea. But this is a good point. There's no shortage of people, social scientists, who produce controversial work in the field of race. But the ones that'll get you on, the work that'll get you on these podcasts are the ones that, at least, you know, if you don't believe for some reason that they're actually racist, then the ones that appear to bolster the claims frequently made by racists. So, you know, it's a little unusual, let's say, a little hard to believe that I'm just defending the right of social scientists to do controversial work, but I'm only telling you about the kind of controversial work that bolsters racist claims for some reason. Even though I claim that the real racism is the work of social scientists who say things like, yeah, there's systemic racism and we really should try to work out a way to stamp it out and to train people to become anti-racist instead. No, that's the real racism. But the fake racism, which most people think is real racism, I acknowledge is still a kind of racism, but I'm going to say that they have a right to discuss that kind of racism. You just don't have a right to discuss the other kind of racism. You see, that's how open and honest I am. They will tell you. Well, anyway, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that some contemporary commentators use antebellum reasoning cynically. Hard right American commentators like David Horowitz have noted the tactical advantages of sounding outraged and morally certain. Who else could do that? And of stressing their status as renegade thinkers to argue for right-wing policies such as more restrictive immigration laws or institutionalized prejudice against Muslims. And he may indeed have learned this from elements of the left. A toxic cancel culture has existed there for a long time. Well, that might be a little too much of a tip of the hat there. But okay. But that doesn't justify so disingenuously magnifying the threat. Others, I suspect, seek the reassurance of antebellum reasoning to help reconcile their ambivalent feelings about cultural and demographic changes. Still others may simply be disillusioned with contemporary politics, intuit that important conversations are somehow not being had, and long for a discourse anchored on simple, easily shared principles. They may have no racist sympathies, nor even be particularly conservative, but that's why the South came up with this form of argument in the first place. It conscripted allies who had no taste for distasteful things into what was cast as a much wider fight. I sympathize with that yearning. I myself was deeply moved by antebellum reasoning as a child. I preferred reading letters written by Confederate soldiers. They talked about bedrock American faiths, which was alluring in a complex world where policy is boring and compromise-laden. Southerners understood that and used it well. Their depiction of our ideals is still the one, subconsciously, for which Americans reach when we feel blown off course. But today, I see what Lincoln feared. Nearly daily, I read some new figure appealing to antebellum reasoning. Joining the reasonable right seems to render these figures desirable contributors to center-left media outlets. There's a link here. I wonder who they're linking to. Walter Kern. Okay. I guess is the new reasonable right figure that she has in mind here. That's because psychologically, the claim to victimhood can function as a veiled threat. It tricks the listener into entering a world where the speaker is the needy one, fragile, requiring the listener to constantly adjust his behavior to cater to the imperiled person. With this threat, the reasonable right has recruited the left into serving its purpose. Media outlets and college campuses now go to extraordinary lengths to prove their balance and tolerance, bending over backward to give platforms to right-wing writers and speakers who already have huge exposure. In the human body, I'm going to change venues here now, viruses use the shells of immune cells to trick other cells into letting them in. Principles like freedom and equality have functioned through time as the American immune system, warding off sickness. But they can also be co-opted. As they were more than 150 years ago, ideas like freedom of speech, diversity, and respect are now being used to turn opponents of conservatism into helpless hosts, transmitting its ideas. If you hear somebody lament, as Bret Stephens does, that political, quote, opinions that were considered reasonable and normal, unquote, not too long ago, now must be, quote, delivered in whispers, it might be antebellum reasoning. If somebody says, as Harris has, that our politics are at risk of ignoring common sense, logic, or the realities of human biology, it might be antebellum reasoning. If somebody such as Nicholas Kristof says they don't like noxious thinkers, but urges us to give them platforms for the sake of, quote, protecting dissonant and unwelcome voices, it might be antebellum reasoning. The truth is, we have more avenues now for free expression in America than we've ever had. If somebody says liberals have become illiberal, you should consider whether it's true. But you should also know that this assertion has a long history and that George Wallace and Barry Goldwater used it in their eras to powerful effect. People who make this claim aren't renegades. They're heirs to an extremely specific tradition in American political rhetoric, one that has become a dangerous inheritance. All right, well, that is something. And what an exposition. That was really actually worth, I think, going back and reading all the way through it, even though it has taken us almost to the top of the hour and the upcoming break, and left us with just little enough, I guess, that we could try to squeeze something in. But I'm afraid we might not get all the way to the other side. But I guess to continue the theme, even though I know we won't get through it before our break, I'll just stay on the subject here. Borrow this time from Amanda Marcotte, writing in Salon about her take on CPAC exploits, with the headline, MAGA sinks GOP trolling to genocidal lows. Genocidal, that'll get your attention every time. Republicans are competing for attention by ratcheting up anti-LGBTQ speech. The inevitable result is violence. And in the context of antebellum reasoning and the historical parallel to the Civil War, maybe it's worth looking at. And what do you know? It's illustrated with a picture of murdery Trader Green. There are two intended audiences, Amanda begins, for the CPAC conference, the semi-annual right-wing conference that has made itself the center of the MAGA movement, the people in the crowd, and the liberals watching from afar. Now, more than ever, the latter audience is more important. Sure, speakers at CPAC want to make the crowd cheer, but more crucially, they want the liberals watching from afar to get outraged because that's where the real money is. Competition is heavy to garner attention by saying the vilest thing on stage. The winner of the biggest trigger of liberals trophy gets awarded with a fawning reception, complete with clicks, donations, and website purchases from the MAGA crowd. Donald Trump tried, of course, to win the biggest troll award this year with his violently fascistic speech, but truth told, the S-bag crown this year went to a D-list right-wing celebrity named Michael Knowles, a Daily Wire contributor whose car crash of a haircut seems designed to reassure the audience that he never lets a queer person touch him. Okay. For the good of society, he says, transgenderism, remember this is the one I was telling you about, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely, Knowles declared during his speech over the weekend, echoing language he's long espoused on his platform. But remember, they're the ones that are just protecting the rights to controversial opinions out there. But they need to eliminate it from public life for whatever reason. As many people were quick to point out, the rhetoric, yes, was clearly genocidal. But Knowles, seizing the CPAC limelight, threw a disingenuous tantrum, insisting that he never specifically mentioned killing people because his goal could theoretically be achieved by simply forcing everyone who identifies as trans to live as their birth-assigned gender, which is, of course, what he's after. Anyway, I don't know how you could have a genocide of transgender people because genocide refers to genes, Knowles went on to argue, which, as many noted, is a definition of genocide that would exclude the Holocaust, so not a particularly useful one. The semantic squabbling was a huge success for Knowles, and not just because it boosted his profile and online engagement. By making the fight over whether or not he was really calling for violence, Knowles pushed the idea that anything short of murder is acceptable. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I think we may have perhaps gotten cut off by our move to the break, and I'll have to repeat that last dramatic portion of the sentence just to make sure that you heard it on the record, right? I'll give you the paragraph, right? The semantic squabbling was a huge success for Knowles. It's Michael, was that right? I've already forgotten. Yes, Michael Knowles. Huge success for him, and not just because it boosted his profile and online engagement, but by making the fight over whether or not he was really calling for violence, Knowles pushed the idea that anything short of actually just murdering people outright to stop people from being trans is okay, A-okay, and acceptable. You know, I wasn't really saying that we should eliminate them from public life entirely, meaning we should kill them. I was just saying, I don't know, put them in a box somewhere until they die. And, maybe then it would be okay. But this rhetoric goes even further. Knowles is also, despite protestations to the contrary, normalizing violence. Under his proposed ban, trans people won't just cease to be trans. There's no other way to scrub them from, quote, public life entirely without violent force. And here, I guess, embedded is a tweet that includes video of an interview with Michael Knowles on the Charlie Kirk show, who, by the way, it says here, Charlie Kirk concludes his interview with Michael Knowles saying, "Best of luck on your genocidal campaign." Kidding. I'm kidding. But not really. In response to the Knowles speech, liberals on Twitter started circulating a photo of him hanging out with a MAGA-themed drag queen. in 2019. How interesting is that? Which was, of course, before Republicans decided that LGBTQ people were going to be the main villains in their fundraising and attention-gathering apparatus. Here he is. Here's the tweet. It's Michael Knowles' own tweet, tweeting out the photo taken with, it says here, Lady MAGA, as opposed to Lady Gaga. Get it, right? Drag queen dressed up with a big sash that says Lady MAGA. And I wonder if that person is reconsidering their hobby or lifestyle. I don't know which one it is. Maybe this person was just trolling the whole time, but I do wonder whether it isn't a drag queen who at the time thought that, the MAGA lifestyle was really the way to go, except now is finding out that it's actually the death style. They want to eliminate you from public life entirely, and maybe you're rethinking the idea of being Lady MAGA. Anyway, at CPAC, where do we leave this off? Oh, yes, right. No, we got it. At CPAC, for instance, the easiest applause line was going hard after the right of trans people to exist. Unsurprisingly, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia made anti-trans hysterics the center of her speech. And here she tweets that clip of her own speech with the comment, the genital mutilation of children should be a felony, not a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's why I'm reintroducing my Protect Children's Innocence Act to end gender-affirming care for minors. Unless, of course, it's breast augmentation or perhaps surgical change in body image elsewhere to reaffirm the cisgender identities. That seems to be A-OK still. And interesting, again, the conflation now, genital mutilation, as opposed to, that's sort of a hijacking of the term. But I guess, whatever, we might be stuck with it, but a hijacking of the term, I think, that used to specifically refer to a very narrow type of practice, and a difficult one to rein in at that, but interesting to see that. And like I say, a hijacking of the term. Interesting also that, for instance, the hijacking of the term human trafficking without recognizing or acknowledging that that's what slavery was. But that kind was awesome because it didn't involve the thing which it actually did involve, which is sexual abuse. And, for whatever reason, they continue to insist that didn't happen. And even if it did, it was pretty awesome. So, okay. Just noting for the record that once again, another hijacking of a term. And also, I think we're probably not helping out a great deal either by helping them conflate transgender issues and drag performance, which I don't think properly ought to belong in the, I don't know, maybe you could put them in a similar category of some kind, but they're not the same thing. That drag performers, by and large, as I understand it, aren't transgender people. They are, in the traditional, if there is such a thing as a traditional presentation of drag performance, we're talking about men masquerading as women, not because they believe they are women or wish they were women, per se. I'm sure that there's got to be some who are drawn to drag performance because of that initially, but now, of course, you can actually make that transition, so they would probably just go ahead and do it, not just live the fantasy from time to time. But then I guess those remaining traditional drag performers simply say, well, they may be same-sex oriented, but they're men and they remain men. And there's no interest in being female. They want to remain men and have relationships with men as men. It's a different thing from being transgender. And we should probably stop conflating it. But at this point, I think we would fall victim to the if you're explaining, you're losing situation. And also, of course, it's like, well, it doesn't really matter what your motivation is. You ought to have the right to do this, and to be targeted for having done it with violence and threats of death and elimination from public life is wrong. And so at this point, it doesn't do anybody any good to necessarily split the hairs. So we just don't. But I don't know. That's hanging out there and it's not great. Anyway, so here's Marjorie Taylor Greene making her anti-trans hysterics the center of her speech. Amanda continues with Greene of usual is lying. Gender-affirming care for minors doesn't involve genital surgeries. Instead, it's a rigorous and slow-moving process that involves years of therapy and sometimes hormonal treatments to slow down puberty, giving a minor lots of time to know for sure before they make any permanent changes in adulthood. But, of course, as Terry Schilling, president of the American Principles Project, admitted in his CPAC talk, all this talk about kids is a pretext for the right's long-term goal of ending rights and medical care for trans people entirely. In his nearly 2-hour speech, Trump also promised a flat-out ban of gender-affirming care for all trans people of any age. Because why not? And remember, of course, that Bushmaster advertising is gender-affirming care by itself, and getting yourself an AR-15 so that you can reissue your man card. That's gender-affirming care, everybody. Sorry. It's psychological care, but, it is what it is. CPAC was once again a dark reminder of how much, for these right-wing pundits, fame and money are a driving motive for spewing such hateful rhetoric, whereas I do it for free. As Will Sommer, author of Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America, told Terry Gross of NPR last week, the amount of money involved in pandering to the MAGA movement is stunning. What matters to the right-wing figureheads is not what they think is true, so much as what they think best sells to the MAGA crowd. Ultimately, what Knowles really thinks is not relevant. The bigger issue is that the ecosystem of right-wing trolling has created a competition of hate on the right as they try to one-up each other with shocking bigotry. As the photo of Knowles shows, just a few years ago, MAGA Republicans didn't talk much about trans people or drag at all. Now, every day it's a race to see who can top the last provocation. Slurring LGBTQ people as groomers used to get the MAGA juices flowing, but now they need the hit to be stronger. Openly eliminationist rhetoric was inevitable in this descent. As CNN reported last week, Governor Ron DeSantis appointed a man to his newly created Disney Oversight Board who has openly denied that gay people existed in the not-so-distant past, even though he then went on in the same speech, as we found out yesterday, to say, well, it was part of the fall of ancient Rome. So, it did exist and it also didn't. That's a great position to take. We should definitely have that guy doing some legal oversight. The board itself, of course, is part of DeSantis' larger war on free speech, as it exists to intimidate Disney executives out of being supportive of LGBTQ rights. His appointee, Ron Perry, was recorded on a Zoom call last year calling gay people evil and asking, why are there homosexuals today? And he went on to theorize that homosexuality is caused by estrogen in drinking water from birth control pills, tacking an attack on women's rights to his rant about gay people. In other words, it's all you women practicing birth control that's turning everybody gay. It's your fault. Of course, gay people have always been around. The only reason for Perry to say otherwise is to imply that the goal of no gay people is achievable. In reality, of course, what Perry's calling for is forcing gay people to live in the closet, which he tips his hat to by euphemistically talking about how the removal of constraint is what causes homosexuality. That is, the constraint of we'll beat you up, kill you, shame you if you don't go back in the closet. That's the restraint. While Republicans love to play semantic games around this issue, the reality is constraint means violence. That was true in 1969, when customers at the Stonewall Inn got fed up with being targeted for arrest for simply being themselves in public. It was true in Nazi Germany, when burning books about LGBTQ issues was a precursor to sending gay people to concentration camps. It is true in countries around the world that still have constraints on gay people that can only be kept in place through arrest and physical violence against those who reject said constraints. You cannot tell people they can't be gay or trans without enforcing that command through violence. This isn't even a hypothetical discussion. Just a few months ago, there was a mass shooting at Club Q, a gay club in Colorado Springs, Colorado, that was hosting a drag show. It was just the most shocking example of what has been an overall rise in murders of trans and gender nonconforming people, like in the wake of Republicans putting a target on their backs of LGBTQ people. Groups like the Proud Boys increasingly target drag shows and pride parades for intimidating demonstrations, some of which have turned violent. They're being encouraged in all this by Republican politicians who respond to this escalating hysteria by introducing bills such as a law just passed in Tennessee, which bans male or female impersonators and is clearly a pretext for legally harassing LGBTQ people. I, in fact, just saw this morning somebody sending around a picture, a historical photo of, was it Jackie Gleason and Bob Hope preparing to do a show in Central Park in 1975, at least for part of which they were dressed for and prepared for putting on a drag routine. And, like we've pointed out 100 different times, it's, definitely a part of our history. And that, like we saw Bill Lee, who signed the bill as governor of Tennessee. It didn't take long for them to just find his high school yearbook. And then, of course, the almost obligatory for the time period picture of big man on campus, Bill Lee, in drag, dressed as a cheerleader, when that was just good, clean fun when American Republican white men did it, but is horrible grooming and somehow human trafficking in a way when people that they don't like or who don't vote Republican actually do it. And I got a letter about it. I mentioned, that happened in my own school as well. It's not like it was unusual. It was actually the most frequent common denominator among high school yearbook photos across the country, probably in that time period and probably up until today. And that there was an actual event of the year. I mean, not just Halloween. It took place around Halloween, but reminded me of the event in the 80s. I don't know whether they still do it, that they used to have, and I don't even know what the hell this event was. Were they raising money for something? Was it just, I don't know what? Powder Puff Football. The Powder Puff Football annual, whatever the hell it was, in which the football players dressed up as cheerleaders and the cheerleaders dressed up as football players and played an actual, touch football game or flag football. I don't know what the hell they did. I don't know why they did it, but we definitely had that. I remember the signs advertising it, all over the school, which was, how's that for something? The public school system in the 1980s, everywhere across the country, having school funds being used to advertise the biggest drag event of the year, making sure that all the kids, if you have any school spirit, you'll come to school in drag this day. And then right up until 2019, when they're posing with Lady MAGA drag queens, everything seems to be fine until they found out that the campaign in a box this year includes anti-drag rhetoric, and you're supposed to pull that out. And, you'll make more money and get more votes if you say, let's murder all the people who are doing the things that we used to do when we were kids. Ha ha. What a great way to run things. Okay, so where were we with this? Right, towards the conclusion of Amanda Marcotte's article here, there's a deep cynicism to the newfound Republican hyper-focus on LGBTQ people. Drag shows, there we are, have been mainstream for a long time. She's talking about something slightly different here, but of course, RuPaul's Drag Race is in its 15th season, but conservatives are acting like drag is a recent invention. I have no doubt these Republicans are sincere in their bigotry. Still, the renewed interest in going after queer people, after chilling out for a few years after they lost the same-sex marriage debate, stems in large part from this desire to keep the MAGA base riled up and hooked in. The leaders want money and attention, and targeting LGBTQ people is currently the best way to get it. The opportunistic air to all of this doesn't change the fact that it's real people who are the targets. This is all ultimately about stripping people of their rights and justifying violence against them. The attacks on LGBTQ people are happening in larger context of Republicans getting more comfortable generally with political violence. As David Siders and Meredith McGraw at Politico reported Monday, Republicans have stopped seeing the events of January 6th as a political liability for Trump. Now, Republican leaders, quote, feel pressure from corners of the base to talk about January 6th in positive terms and rally to the defense of people arrested following the riot. Which is to say, being supportive of domestic terrorism is becoming the mainstream view of the GOP. January 6th was a targeted attempt to overthrow the U.S. government, but the form most domestic terrorism takes is hate crimes. That's why these hair-splitting semantic debates over whether or not it's genocidal to say transgenderism must be eradicated should be regarded as nothing more than gaslighting. It's genocidal on its surface, as there's no way to eradicate, quote, transgenderism without targeting actual trans people. But it's true in an even broader sense. Even Republicans who avoid the word eradicate, but still use words like groomer, know exactly what they're doing. They're speaking to an increasingly unhinged MAGA base that has embraced violence as a means to get their way. Dehumanizing people always runs the risk of violence, but in this particular situation, it's guaranteeing it. All right, always worth checking in with Amanda on these things, I think. And now maybe we shift things a little bit. Oh, maybe not. We do have at least one more take. I was interested in these headlines on takeaways from CPAC. I know we're contributing in some respect to exactly the outrage machine they're looking to maintain. But this, okay, from Alternate, let's see, where's the origin of this? Brandon Gage, writing at Alternate under the headline, A Gathering of Sexual Predators. That's somewhat intriguing. Democratic official tears into CPAC over its rhetoric and values hypocrisy. Lindy Lee, L.I., Lindy Lee, the women's co-chair and Mid-Atlantic regional chair at the Democratic National Committee, tore into the notable lack of Christian family values on display at the 2023 conservative, CPAC conference in National Harbor. I didn't feel like reading out the whole long name. We'll just go with CPAC. All of this happening this past weekend, of course. She did this, though, during an appearance on MSNBC early Sunday afternoon. Lee opined to MSNBC Reports host Yasmin Vasogian, I hope I got that right, that CPAC has been using coded language to push a racist agenda. Lee also noted that many of the featured speakers at the annual event, like former President Donald Trump, do not embody the morality that they preach. Let's be clear what anti-woke means. It's anti-black. And I think people are very reluctant to say it, but she says, I don't miss any words. I imagine she means mince. She may even have said mince and it just got transcribed as miss. I don't know. And that's the truth. That's their way of, sounding the dog whistle without being extremely explicit. Okay. And let's also not ignore the fact that CPAC has become a gathering of sexual predators. That's the interesting part here. Let's be honest. Matt Schlapp, the chairman, was sued for $10 million for allegedly groping a male staffer on the Herschel Walker campaign. And then he shares the stage with Jim Jordan, who allegedly covered up sex crimes at Ohio State. And then he was followed by Matt Gaetz, who was just investigated by the FBI for teen sex trafficking. And then he was followed by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's an adulteress. Okay. And then Lauren Boebert, who brags about carrying a Glock around Congress and just this week threatened to blow up metal detectors. I didn't realize she was going to blow up the metal detectors. But also, by the way, a staunch defender of her husband, who was, of course, arrested for exposing himself to teenage girls at the local bowling alley back in the day. But that doesn't even get a mention. And then finally, we have Trump, a serial rapist. And so this is the party that claims to be the party of Christian family values. And I had nothing to say or do but laugh at that. Well, That's pretty on the nose here. And, of course, if you like, we'll provide you with the link to this appearance, which itself, there's an embedded tweet in here that has a link to the video if you'd like to see it said for yourself. Let's see. I think we still have at least one more on this CPAC nonsense. Where did this one come from? Oh, and then we can get to some other stories. But something in the New Yorker that appeared intriguing as well. And if I can still grab it for free, I will. John Cassidy's piece from yesterday. The serious takeaway from CPAC: Trump and Trumpism are still a threat. I don't think anybody here doubts that. But let's confirm a few priors in a special way, shall we? Behind all the craziness, in a movement that has given up on truth and respecting democracy, writes John Cassidy. During the 2016 presidential race, one of the wiser things said about Donald Trump by Selena Zito in The Atlantic was that he should be taken seriously, not literally. That was kind of confusing at the time, right? However fantastical, odious, and self-centered Trump's campaign appeared to many members of the media, it struck some deep, dark nerves running through American society. But now, 6.5 years later, after all that has happened, including disappointing election results for Trump and the Republican Party in 2020 and 2022, how seriously should we take him and his supporters? Judging by press coverage of this year's CPAC conference, where Trump delivered the closing address on Saturday evening, the answer is not very seriously. You think? Perhaps taking their cue from what used to be called the Republican establishment, key members of which boycotted this year's CPAC, many media organizations adopted a dismissive tone, which was well captured by a headline at Politico: CPAC's Road to Irrelevance. Given the carnival atmosphere that has attended CPAC, an event once synonymous with Cold Warriors and Reaganites, as Trump acolytes have taken it over, plus allegations of sexual misconduct against CPAC's current chair, Matt Schlapp, accusations that he has denied, it's seriously tempting to dismiss the whole thing as an early spring break for MAGAs and charlatans, mere fodder for late-night comedians, as of course reminding us that Jimmy Kimmel suggested CPAC stands for clowns periodically assembling in convention centers. But what if treating Trump and his followers as a joke amounts to repeating the mistake that many political observers made in 2016? In his closing address to the conference, which took place at the Gaylord National Resort and Convention Center in National Harbor, Maryland, which is funny if you're 12, or a MAGA Republican, I guess, at least ironic, Trump called Joe Biden a criminal, insinuated that Mitch McConnell was a Chinese sympathizer, and pledged that if reelected, he would deliver retribution for those who have been wronged or betrayed, a victimized group in which he certainly places himself. That sounds like typical Trump, you may say. The ex-president is nothing if not mind-numbingly repetitive, but after January 6th, familiarity with Trump's charges and threats is surely no excuse for being blasé about them. From the CPAC stage, an ex-president promised to exact vengeance on his enemies if he returns to power. And so far, virtually the only Republican who has raised any objection is Asa Hutchinson, former governor of Arkansas, who told CNN that Trump's remarks were troubling. That's what you're going to get out of Susan Collins as well. One purpose that events like CPAC serve is to remind us how far Trumpian language and Trumpian values have advanced since the future election denier-in-chief rode down the escalator at Trump Tower in June of 2015. Hours before Trump's address, Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, whom Human Rights Watch has described as an apologist for Brazil's abusive military dictatorship and a threat to Brazilian democracy, received a warm welcome from the crowd. After losing in his re-election bid last year and mimicking Trump by questioning the results, Bolsonaro pulled another Trump move and decamped to Florida. Walking back and forth across the stage like an overamped TED Talk presenter, he got the crowd to its feet when he recalled how he didn't, quote, force anyone to be vaccinated in Brazil. Turning to his re-election campaign, he said, "I had way more support in 2022 than I had in 2018, and I don't understand why the numbers reflected the opposite." Facing an official investigation into whether he inspired his supporters to ransack Brazil's Congress and other government buildings in Brasilia on January 8th, no connection there, I'm sure, Bolsonaro refrained from explicitly claiming that the Brazilian election, which international observers have said was transparent and safe, had been stolen. Not so the speaker who followed him, the Trump donor and big lie promoter Mike Lindell, a.k.a. the My Pillow guy. All right, and I'm late with the music, but let's get out of here. After telling the crowd that he monitored the Brazilian election with his team, Lindell said, "They stole over 10 million votes that we know of there." Even Bolsonaro doesn't think that's the case. He also insisted that American democracy was lost unless voting machines were replaced by paper ballots. A bit later, crazy lady Kari Lake showed up, and we'll tell you what she was up to, perhaps after this break and in a roundup.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Fooled myself by exiting differently and having the music mistimed. But okay, time to get back to work here. We were reading through, which one? The New Yorker's exposition of what had been going on at CPAC, and noting that, Mike Lindell got out ahead of Bolsonaro on the Brazilian elections, which is kind of interesting. So Bolsonaro, kind of vaguely hinted that he didn't understand why he hadn't won and that something must have gone wrong, but he didn't hint, or he didn't get explicit about the election having been stolen. But Mike Lindell said he totally found 10 million stolen ballots there. Okay, sure. Well, anyway, it says a bit later, Kari Lake, the former Phoenix News anchor who ran for governor of Arizona last year, expanded on her baseless claim that she was defrauded of victory and said that she had just filed a lawsuit with the Arizona Supreme Court. Yeah, sure. Of course she did. "We are exposing these criminals who are stealing our elections. We are exposing them every single day." And in fact, they're losing every single day, but whatever. Lake also claimed that some unnamed powerful people back east had tried, through an intermediary, to bribe her into stepping away from politics. And of course, back east was in fact where she was right then when she was making the speech. So that's kind of weird, unless she was appearing by video link. I don't know. Those weren't even the loopiest speeches of the afternoon. That prize went to Gordon Chang, a conservative columnist and longtime Uber hawk on China, addressing COVID-19. You can probably guess where this is going on YouTube. This is not us saying this. This is a kooky person who shouldn't be believed, who said that the Chinese government, quote, deliberately spread it beyond its borders to America and to the world, and that means every coronavirus death in the United States is a murder. Well, that's the end of the quote, and maybe it is, but I would have charged Trump with it. Should we take such claims literally? Obviously not. That way, madness lies. but they represent an integral part of a right-wing movement that long ago gave up on liberal niceties like truth and respecting democratic outcomes, and which remains an unavoidable feature of the American political topography. During Trump's speech, which meandered on for about an hour and 40 minutes, like this show, I always say, he name-checked Chang, along with murdery Trader Green, of course, Matt Gaetz, Mark Levin, Tucker Carlson, and other figures in the post-truth MAGA firmament. He also consigned the pre-2016 GOP to history, the whole party, saying, "We had a Republican Party that was ruled by freaks, neocons, globalists, open border zealots, and fools. But we're never going back to the party of Paul Ryan, Karl Rove, and Jeb Bush." He added, "People are tired of rhinos and globalists. They want to see America first. That's what they want. It's not too complicated." The people Trump was referring to are Republican voters, the vast majority of whom weren't present at CPAC or at the rival meeting this weekend in Palm Beach, by the way, held by the Club for Growth, a conservative organization that has distanced itself from Trump. What do these voters really want? It's hard to say for sure, but a significant number of them still appear to support Trump, despite the fact that his re-election campaign has had a slow start. The two most recent polls of potential GOP primary voters, which were carried out by Emerson College and Fox News, which, has some problems, put Trump's support at 55% and 43%, respectively. That's some disparate results, with Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, who has not declared himself a presidential candidate yet, running well behind him at 25% and 28%. Of course, it's still early. The GOP Iowa caucuses are almost 11 months away, and current poll numbers may not have much predictive value. At a minimum, though, they suggest that we can't afford to dismiss the continuing threat from Trump and what he represents, regardless of how absurd it sometimes seems. Yes, CPAC is nuts, but the movement it embodies is no laughing matter. Well, a little bit of laughing. But yes, also quite worrisome. Okay. So, I can't remember whether that is completely it for CPAC material or not. I think so. I think that's it for direct CPAC references. Although now I realize I have yet another Amanda Marcotte piece in the wings here. And maybe I ought to read it. I know it's a little bit too much, maybe, Amanda Marcotte material for today. But I don't know. Can you really have too much? We should probably just have her come on the show and explain things to us. But I don't know. She seems like a busy person. Anyway, this one I wanted to use a couple of days ago, and it is only a few days old. But again, an interesting take. She always finds an interesting angle on something we're already all talking about. This piece from March 3rd, The Truth About GOP Hypocrisy, Jessica Duggar's abortion, you remember we discussed that a little bit, and Bill Lee's drag, which we mentioned again today, are more than gotchas. Let's see what she means by this. The subheader tells us, laws banning drag and abortion were always meant to be selectively enforced against those the Christian right hates. So, yeah, right. There's no victory, therefore, necessarily of any kind in showing, well, yeah, Jessica Duggar, did I say Jessica? Jessica Duggar, was able to avail herself of an abortion and pretend that it wasn't an abortion, of the type that absolutely is widely necessary and widely sought by women of all sorts all over the place. And then, of course, Bill Lee and the drag picture. Well, why doesn't this apply? And the answer is because I'm me and you're not me, and I'm cool and you're terrible. The things I want are awesome. The things you want are terrible. It's pure gimmitarianism, but you should realize that. Yes, it's ridiculous to let Republicans have control of the legislative process because they're going to pass laws like this stupid one that would ordinarily, if fairly applied, would call for one thing, would have as we said, would have gotten Bob Hope and Jackie Gleason arrested in Tennessee, though it was performed in Central Park in 1975 and just fine, and everyone understood the approach and humor of it, apparently. But now would get you arrested. Well, what about Bill Lee's own, the bill he signed? He should be arrested for what he was doing while he was in high school. Even worse, the fact that he was in high school when he was doing it by some Republican reckoning, I'm sure. But as Amanda points out, the point is never to use laws like that and apply them fairly and across the board, because that would only be embarrassing. And it would, of course, highlight how bad and how badly the law was drafted, how bad it is, how poorly it was written, how dumb it is, how overbroad it is. But it doesn't worry them that that's the case, because they never intended to apply the law fairly to begin with, so they'll be fine. Like many a professional opinion haver who has been at it a long time, I grow weary of Republicans are hypocrites discourse. This has, of course, been a demonstrable truth for a very long time now, yet it never seems to move the needle. The party of, quote, family values is in the thrall of a thrice-divorced chronic adulterer who bragged about how he likes to grab them by the pussy. You all remember that. Clearly, being seen as hypocrites doesn't bother the vast majority of Republican politicians or voters. If anything, they probably like how their bad faith triggers the liberals. And yet, I can't quite blow off two recent stories about the depraved depths of Republican hypocrisy: right-wing reality TV star Jessa Duggar Seawald terminating a pregnancy, and photos surfacing of anti-drag Republican politicians wearing women's clothes. In both cases, it's not just that the people involved are massive hypocrites. Republicans love to make noble claims about their intentions as if they care about protecting life or protecting children. In reality, as these stories show, their main goal is policing people's personal lives and self-expression based on gender. The hypocrisy is annoying. The hate that the hypocrisy reveals, however, is what is truly terrifying. On Thursday, Republican Governor Bill Lee of Tennessee signed a broad law meant to ban drag in public, claiming it's a threat to children. Critics argue that the law is so broad it could ban even banal drag performances at, say, a pride parade. Still, the GOP governor signed the ban, even though photos were recently published showing that Lee himself has performed in drag in full view of underage people, no less. And, of course, embedded is the tweet that carries the picture of which we're speaking. Shortly thereafter, similar footage of Texas State Representative Nate Schatzline, no idea, who has authored another bill criminalizing drag, was released. Again, his drag performance was outside where children could see it, which is what Republicans say they're trying to prevent. How strange. In both cases, these Republicans have turned to gaslighting and word games to pretend that their turn in drag is somehow not drag. Lee called his drag performance lighthearted. The lightheartedness exception, I did not know. And contrasted it with supposedly sexualized entertainment. Schatzline complained that he was just, quote, wearing a dress as a joke back in school for a theater project, which is, of course, what a drag performance is. None of these arguments make a lick of sense. If you've ever seen an episode of RuPaul's Drag Race or haven't seen any drag queen ever, you would know that lighthearted and theater project are qualities of most, if not all, drag performances. Moreover, Lee is being dishonest by pretending there's nothing sexualized about his drag performance. The humor of cross-dressing pranks only works under the assumption that real women are sexy and these dudes in dresses are not. Indeed, the caption on Lee's yearbook photo is "Hard Luck Woman," which may be mild in the realms of blue humor, but it doesn't work without the sexual implications. It's certainly a much dirtier joke than anything you'll hear at the drag queen story hours that Republicans are up in arms about. Yeah, where they don't make any sexualized jokes at all. They read a book for kids straight. It doesn't take Columbo to figure out what Lee and Schatzline are implying, even as they won't come right out and say it. Their drag doesn't count because they're straight. The point of Republicans' anti-trans laws is to create a pretext for enforcement to harass queer people, not straight men like themselves. Digging in a little deeper even, it's really about the Republican obsession with policing gender more broadly. The kind of drag that Lee and Schatzline are doing is about mocking women and mocking femininity. The joke is that being a woman is a debased position. The kind of drag they're trying to ban, the queer kind, is about the opposite message. Femininity is awesome. These two men were exaggerating how bad they are at looking like women, using humor to remind everyone of their maleness and therefore superior social status. But queer drag performers want to look good and go to great pains, literally, if you look up tucking, for instance, to bury themselves in the feminine fantasy. Lee and Schatzline were trying to serve man in a dress. Saying a professional drag queen looks like a man in a dress, however, is an insult to her skills. Or, to be less academic about it, Republicans think drag is okay if it's misogynist. But if it's pro-woman and pro-queer, then they're calling the cops. The Duggar case is similar and has caused quite a stir in pro-choice circles and defensiveness on the right. It's not just that Seawald's family, the Duggar clan of the 19 Kids and Counting franchise on TLC, is famously conservative or that they've been outspoken against abortion rights. The Duggar family found fame by holding themselves out as living proof that women need no access to birth control or abortion, by presenting constant childbearing as natural, with no downsides. Things started when Seawald released a tearful video about having to abort a wanted pregnancy because she was miscarrying, and letting the process carry through naturally was too risky for her health. It's likely she didn't realize the procedure she's describing is an abortion, as doctors often avoid using the A word when terminating pregnancies in these circumstances. But as many people pointed out, medical intervention to terminate a pregnancy is the definition of abortion, which is why we're seeing so many horror stories of patients in similar situations to Seawald being denied medical care. And in here is the embedded tweets telling the Seawald story. Seawald claims in her that her procedure wasn't an abortion because her embryo was already dead. That may have made it legal in Arkansas, but it doesn't mean it wasn't an abortion. As Jessica Valenti points out, abortion is not an intention, and it certainly doesn't have a debatable definition, but it's a medical intervention to end pregnancy. That's it. Indeed, the medical term for a miscarriage that occurs naturally is spontaneous abortion. That gets pointed out quite a lot, but they ignore that, generally speaking. Ultimately, the semantic tug-of-war is about trying to distract from what this really is about, gender and power. Republicans don't like abortion for the same reason they keep trying to cut off access to birth control. Pregnancy to them is an offer women have no right to refuse. Abortion and contraception free women to do all sorts of things the right disapproves of, from having career ambitions to being selective about who they marry or if they marry at all. But Seawald presents herself not just as a member of the right-wing tribe, but as a woman who lives by their strict gender ideals that cast women as vessels for husbands and children instead of full humans who are equal to men. As pro-choicers have long pointed out, abortion laws were always meant to be selectively enforced. They're a pretext to punish women who live outside the strict gender rules that Republicans want to place on women. It's single women, women of color, perceived feminists, and poorer women who will find themselves suspected of illegal abortion. The law may ban the procedure, but the real purpose is penalizing women who don't fit the Duggar model of what women should be. These situations are interesting from a legal perspective because it shows the limitations of using the law the way Republicans want to, which is to force their narrow cultural prescriptions about gender onto everyone else. But these cases also do a great job in exposing the very intentions conservatives are trying to hide. The concern is never life or children's innocence. It's always about restricting the ability of other people, mostly other adults, who want to make personal choices that Republicans don't like, from how they dress to how they identify to even when they give birth. Hypocrisy may not matter much to voters. This unwillingness to just leave other people alone, however, the polls show that's still politically toxic. So again, another slight twist on the perspective, and well worth it, I think, to spend more time with Amanda on that one. And maybe a straight reading is probably the shortest way we can get through it. But at any rate, thought I would add that to the mix here. Now for a couple of shorter items that have been waiting their turn, not that long. This one I think I picked up just yesterday. Though it's from March 3rd, I think, in the AP reporting from Colorado. Just a little follow-up on a name we have raised a couple of times. Nice headline: election-denying former Colorado clerk guilty of obstruction. Well, out in Grand Junction, Colorado, they have this news for us. Former Colorado clerk, who has become a hero, of course, to election conspiracy theorists, was convicted Friday of a misdemeanor obstruction charge for trying to prevent authorities from taking an iPad that she allegedly used to videotape a court hearing. How do you like that? So it's all related to her weird election denial theories, but not directly in this case, right? So an obstruction charge for trying to prevent authorities from taking an iPad she allegedly used to videotape a court hearing. The case is separate from Tina Peters' alleged involvement in a security breach of voting machines. Jurors found Peters guilty of obstructing government operations, but acquitted her of obstructing a peace officer, the Daily Sentinel reported. She was charged last year after allegedly recording a court hearing involving a subordinate who was also charged in the alleged voting machine breach. Testimony during the 2-day trial included that Peters repeatedly told investigators that the iPad did not belong to her and that she could not provide the password because it belonged to someone else named Tammy Bailey. Peters' lawyer, Harvey Steinberg, said that was an alias used by Peters, suggesting it was created for security reasons. Her own lawyer says that. It's her right not to give out the passcode, he said in closing arguments. It's not a crime, unless, of course, you're ordered to do so by the court and refuse. That would be a problem. Peters was briefly detained on February 8th of 2022 at a cafe, I remember this one, where she was meeting with other people when investigators from the district attorney's office showed up with a warrant to seize that iPad. Peters gave the iPad to another person, and police were then called. Peters then got between the officers and the man to try to prevent them from taking the iPad. Peters was handcuffed and taken outside without warning, which was also captured on police body camera video. She's struggling with us the whole time as we were trying to get the handcuffs on, Officer Vaughn Sonderquist testified. Ms. Peters escalated in her behavior, so we removed her to calm things down. Peters, who is running to become the leader of Colorado's Republican Party, by the way, is scheduled to be sentenced on April 10th. The obstruction charge carries a sentence of up to 6 months in jail and a $750 fine. The charge Peters was acquitted of would have carried a sentence of up to a year in jail. Peters has pleaded not guilty to 7 felony charges related to her role in allegedly accessing confidential voter machine data in 2021 while she was clerk. That trial is scheduled for August. The subordinate whose hearing Peters is accused of recording, Belinda Nisley, as well as another election worker, Sandra Brown, have both pleaded guilty under deals that require them to testify against Peters. So that ought to be interesting in its own right. I wonder whether the report from the Daily Sentinel, the local paper covering it, is available and whether it gives us any more interesting detail. And it is available. You want to hear what Charles Ashby of the Daily Sentinel had to say. A jury finds Peters guilty of obstruction charge but acquits on arrest. Let's see. Former Mesa County Clerk Tina Peters found guilty of obstruction, right? But acquitted on charges that she obstructed a police officer. She was guilty of obstruction of government operations instead. Sentencing April 10th. You already know about that. 6 months in jail is the max, $750 fine. The 2 misdemeanor charges stem from that incident in the Main Street Bagels Cafe on February 8th, 2022, when they tried to execute a search warrant to seize that iPad. When Peters obstructed the attempt, investigators called the Grand Junction Police Department, who ended up arresting Peters. But according to court testimony from the main arresting officer, von Sonderquist, the embattled former clerk was not the first target of an arrest, but someone who was with Peters at the time to whom she handed the iPad. Investigators had asked police to detain that person, Randy Bremer, because he, at the time, was the last known person to have possession of the iPad after Peters handed it to him to keep it away from them. But when Sonderquist and Officer Rosario Tafoya moved in, Peters immediately got in the way, blocking their attempt to reach Bremer. Without hesitation or a verbal warning for Peters to move, the officer handcuffed her and pulled her out of the restaurant. In her testimony, Tafoya said she was following Sonderquist's lead, who is the more experienced of the 2 officers. Tafoya said that at the time she thought Peters was Randy when Sonderquist grabbed her arm as he tried to move in on Bremer, who ultimately was not arrested. Why not? Also not arrested was another woman Bremer allegedly gave the iPad to, Anna Lee Elliott, who allegedly was sitting on it to hide it from the investigators. This is not super sophisticated, but why can't they get this damn pad? Soderquist, I guess, there's no N in there, said he detained Peters because she pushed back on him and he wanted to calm the situation. She's struggling with us the whole time, right? We heard about that one. We wanted things to calm down. It worked. District Attorney Investigator Robert Howell testified. Soon after, Bremer and Elliott were more cooperative, and the iPad was retrieved on a chair where Elliott had been sitting with spilled coffee on it, Howell testified. A witness for the prosecution who testified as an expert in arrest tactics, Mesa County Sheriff's Office Sergeant Marco Montes, told Peters' attorney, Harvey Steinberg, that normally the thing to do is to issue 1 or 2 verbal warnings to someone to get out of the way before actually arresting them. During the jury's deliberations, the 4 women and 2 men on the panel had asked to see the body camera footage of that arrest again, which has been shown numerous times during the trial. I would want to see it again just for fun. Well, investigators were trying to obtain the iPad. One of the reasons Peters gave for not handing it over was that the device was not hers, saying it actually belonged to someone named Tammy Bailey. During the trial, however, testimony and statements from Peters' attorney revealed that Bailey is an alias that Peters had created for herself, because she's totally not crazy. After she was released by police, Peters told DA investigator Michael Struy that she could not give him the passcode to the iPad because she didn't know it, suggesting that he find Bailey, but declined to tell him how she could be reached. But she wasn't a real person. So it is her right not to give out the passcode, Steinberg said in his closing arguments. It's not a crime. Other testimony, which came from a fellow election denier who had been working with Peters since the beginning of her election denying brouhaha, Corey Anderson, testified for the prosecution that he helped Peters set up a cell phone with the name Tammy Bailey, saying he knew it to be a false name for Peters. In his closing arguments, Steinberg said that the entire thing was a setup, one meant to arrest Peters at the onset. District Attorney Dan Rubenstein, however, said that was not true. He said that the police weren't summoned until after Peters obstructed his investigators in obtaining the iPad. Peters' conviction, however, means that separate charges of contempt of court can go forward. That's the underlying case that led to the search warrant and subsequent obstruction charges. There, Peters is accused of using the iPad to video record a court proceeding for her former deputy, Belinda Knisley, who at the time was facing a burglary and cybercrime charge for allegedly entering the clerk's office after being told to stay away. At that time, Knisley was under investigation by county human resources officials for creating a hostile work environment, allegedly telling clerk staff not to cooperate with state and federal investigations into tampering with election equipment. Well, they were doing that. Eventually, Peters and Knisley and former elections manager Sandra Brown were charged with election tampering, influencing a public servant, and criminal impersonation. All very interesting. That's, I guess, maybe what you can be charged with down in Tennessee now if you're in drag. Criminal impersonation. Both Knisley and Brown reached plea deals with prosecutors and are to testify against Peters at her August trial. The former clerk faces 7 felony and 3 misdemeanor charges of tampering with election equipment, identity theft, and misconduct in office. It's an unwise position for her to be taking, insisting, 1, on her stupid election conspiracy theories, and 2, actually acting on it, and then 3, of course, trying to use her official position to do the very thing that she insisted the criminals were trying to do, break into the voting machines and steal the code and steal the information inside. It's a very weird way of proving that these things could possibly happen. I can prove that these crimes are real by committing them myself is just not really a great strategy. All right. Well, time to hand things over at any rate. Well, it's ordinarily, as I say, time for Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. But, as it turns out, here I am with all this time to read you the preview of what he had in store for you. And I find instead that the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy will be preempted today, though there will be a podcast later on. Some, personal biz taking precedence there in the Pacific Northwest for everybody today. Joan will hopefully see back next week. West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy podcast later today, and we hope they'll be back live with the show tomorrow.
Networksradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
That's not to say that there won't be West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy style programming. In its place today, an interview with R.J.M. Blackett, the Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University, on his new biography of anti-slavery activist Samuel Ringgold Ward. Stay tuned. We'll see you tomorrow.